So, this video is a little bit late, but unfortunately I've just been drowning in schoolwork and videos and my province being both metaphorically and literally on fire, and maybe slightly did a tiny bit of overpromising when it came to my output this month. Turns out, when you're someone who's usually at full capacity with 15 credits and 2 videos a month, you maybe shouldn't ramp that up by deciding to triple the number of videos you're making right before your finals. And that's especially true for these members' choice videos, since I can't really start preparing for any of them too much before they've won their polls. I've tried, but if a topic doesn't get picked and then it gets pushed back to a later month, there's a good chance that the script will be outdated by then anyways, so it'll just need to be rewritten. Overwatch's Omnics or Shallow Storytelling got picked as the topic for this video on May 10th, with an original intended release date of May 19th. A release date that I intended to meet until Blizzard decided to drop the bombshell out of absolutely nowhere on the 16th that PvE was being dramatically watered down from what had been initially promised. The initial script for this video had involved a lot of the discussion for PvE, both in terms of concerns I had with how Omnics would be handled and the potential for them to improve the overall state of things with them. PvE, as it was initially pitched, is not happening. That much is clear. Unfortunately, as of time of writing, we don't actually know how this new version of PvE will manifest, and given Blizzard's track record at this point, I hope I don't need to explain why I decided to just rewrite the video and avoid talking about it too much. There's a million Overwatch content creators offering their hot takes on PvE, and while I'll probably inevitably join the discourse, it won't be until after Season 6 launches and we get to properly see some of the damage at a bare minimum, assuming that they actually do release some PvE content in Season 6. It's supposedly still going to be story content, but like, go watch my video about how Overwatch has routinely failed to expand its narrative universe if you want to know why I don't have much faith in Archives Plus doing much for the story. For this video's intents and purposes, we're not really going to be considering it much, either in terms of what I predict might happen or what Blizzard has promised. I don't trust them as far as I can throw them, and given the path that PvE has taken up to this point, it's just safer to err on the side of not treating their commitments as gospel. Also, apologies if I sound a little bit hoarse in this one. Functionally, my entire province has been in a state of, you can't go outside without a mask or open your windows because the air is trying to kill you, thanks to Alberta's wildfire season being even more out of control than normal. You might think that a province that's been governed by conservatives who use God to justify their position that I don't deserve equal rights for 84 of the last 88 years would maybe recognize this as an act of God condemning both major political parties in our current election for refusing to take climate change seriously, but hey, that would be inconvenient for the Shell Corporation, so to Tidewater we go. Also, I've been running my second ever ugliest thumbnail tournament on the channel, and I am proud to announce that the winner is my We Need to Talk About Monroe thumbnail. It beat some worthy competitors, but in the words of one of the voters, this thumbnail absolutely screamed graphic design is my passion. Finally, before we start, this is the first of 2 Members' Choice videos for May. The first round featured these 5 topics and was open from May 1st to May 10th, with Omnics taking the first win with 5 of the 11 votes. The second round featured the 4 losing topics from the first and was open from the 11th to the 20th, and with 28 votes cast, the poll ended with True Crime at 1 vote, Competitive Overwatch at 5 votes, 999 at 10 votes, and Clue with the win at 12. This one was actually extremely close between 999 and Clue pretty much the whole time, and was actually a 9-9 tie between the two up until the last 12 hours when some True Crime voters flipped. Also, side note, holy shit, thank you so much to all the new channel members. There are a lot more of you than there were a couple months ago. The Clue video was originally intended to come out on the 26th, but for the aforementioned reasons of me being an idiot who bit off way more than he could chew, it might be delayed while I prepare for my finals in the last week of May. I apologize to the members, I really hate to delay this stuff, and in the future I'm going to make sure that if I make a promise, it's one that I can actually meet. Unlike Activision Blizzard, I want people to be able to trust me when I say that I'm going to release something on a certain date. I just didn't have any slack in the rope for May, and it turns out I should have built some into my plan. The Clue video will either be out on Monday, May 29th, or else Friday, June 2nd, depending on when I can get it done, and videos will resume their normal bi-weekly schedule starting on June 9th. Now, 999 may have lost yet again this time, but it will get another chance next month. When it comes to the Members' Choice topics, the second place topics will always make a comeback in the next month's Members' Choice poll, with third place skipping a month before getting another chance, and fourth place skipping 2 months. That means that Why Didn't True Crime cross over into video games will be coming back in August, The Missing Link in Competitive Overwatch will be coming back in July, and 999 Made Me Hit the Titanic and Telepathy will be coming back for June. Speaking of, the June topics are 1. Against the Storm and game genres, which is a returnee from the first poll back in April. This video would look at Against the Storm and see why its weird existence as a roguelike city builder works so well, and what it might say about how we perceive genres in video games compared to music, movies, or TV shows. 2. 999 Made Me Hate the Titanic and Telepathy, which has appeared in literally every poll so far. This video would be about the importance of editing, character development, and story planning when it comes to video game narratives. 3. Overwatch's weird relationship with representation, a brand new topic for this month's poll talking about the nature of representation in Overwatch over time, focusing particularly on queer representation for Pride Month. And 4. Positive and negative balance, another brand new topic for the June poll, this one talking about the philosophical ways we approach the concepts of balance, nerfs, buffs, and power in games. The June poll will launch on June 1st at midnight Mountain Time and will run until midnight on the 10th, with the winner coming out on the 23rd. Channel memberships purchased in May will last for 31 days, so if you bought a membership in May or were gifted one, you'll be able to vote in June. Although if you bought your membership in the first week or so of May and don't plan on renewing, I would suggest voting ASAP when the poll comes out. If you don't already have a membership, you can get one for $5 by clicking the join button below to get access to the polls, plus some exclusive updates and fun emotes. Or you can stop by one of my live streams and see if you can get gifted one. This has been a long intro, my apologies, but in my defense, I can't get a good deal from Raid for sponsorship, so I've got to hustle however I can on this. Regardless, let's move on from the intro to the deduction. Part 1. What are we talking about? For a video titled Overwatch's Omnics are shallow storytelling, we should first probably establish what exactly the Omnics are and the role they play in the Overwatch universe. So that's what we're going to do. The story begins with the Omnica Corporation, whose initial goal was to revolutionize robotics manufacturing through their Omnics. Originally, the Omnics were not sentient. Probably easiest to think of Omnica as like iRobot, and the original Omnics is a collection of glorified Roombas, Scubas, and other associated robot slaves. The big innovation with Omnica was that their factories, known as Omniums, were self-improving, self-running factories powered by nuclear fusion. So long as you provided the materials, it'd build the bots for you. According to the wiki, there were 5 known Omniums built by Omnica in Australia, the East China Sea, Nigeria, Russia, and the US, with at least one additional one being built by an AI program called Anubis during the Omnic crisis. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The Omnica Corporation brought about a global economic revolution, supposedly curing global poverty through the industrial output of their robots. Their work on AI was initially done carefully, with an understanding that their robots with sufficiently advanced AI could be a problem. However, eventually capitalism prevailed. The need for perpetual growth pushed Omnica to hire Mina Liao, a robotics genius who's about to girl boss a little too close to the sun, to take their adaptive AI to the next level. She wanted to create a sentient robot, and Omnica was about to let her do it. As I said, the Omnics were not initially sentient. They were legitimately treated like a Roomba, albeit one that could function more as an all-purpose slave. If you're familiar with Detroit Become Human or any number of other pieces of media about robots becoming sentient, I'm going to take a moment to explain what that means. Sentience refers to the capacity to not just perceive others or think, but also to feel, to perceive oneself, and to possess an actual consciousness. It's the difference between like how a human creates art and how an AI program creates art. Art, in the heaviest air quotes. The philosophy behind the concept of sentience is incredibly dense, and we won't dive into it too deeply here. This video is already going to be too long, but for our purposes, we need to establish that this is a fundamental difference between something like the androids of Detroit Become Human and the Omnics. In Become Human, the androids are probably best understood as inherently being sentient, or at least inherently possessing the capacity for it, but having limiters placed on them to try and restrict their capacity for expressing it. Androids are not only capable of breaking this programming, becoming deviants in the game's terminology, but also capable of resisting the emotional impulses to do so. Like, of the 3 playable characters, Marcus deviates as a consequence of being attacked by the son of his current owner and the feeling of outrage over how humans have treated him. And Kara deviates as a consequence of her protective impulse to defend a child named Alice from her abusive father. But Connor? Connor's unique in the sense that his deviance is the result of the player choice. If the player chooses to follow the orders that he's given and the task at hand, he'll maintain his software stability and stay a machine. If he chooses to make the more human choices and go against his orders, he'll become more unstable, become more deviant. In other words, the androids already have the capacity for sentience. If they didn't, Marcus and Kara wouldn't have been able to have such a strong emotional reaction to cause the deviance to begin with, and Connor wouldn't have the capacity to choose whether or not to stream Break Free by Ariana Grande and become a deviant himself. The androids are conscious but limited. The Omnics in Overwatch did not have the capacity for sentience built into them, at least not en masse in terms of their hardware, but rather developed it down the road through more spiritual means as a consequence of their AI. And that brings us back to Mina Liao. Liao created Aurora, a humanoid Omnic imbued with the most advanced AI Omnica had ever put out. So advanced, in fact, that Liao was able to successfully campaign for Aurora to be given legal personhood. However, turns out, if you fuck around, you might just find out. Aurora's creation drew a lot of eyeballs to Omnica, both from legislators and regulators, and between the UN imposing restrictions on future AI research and Omnica collapsing under the weight of corporate fraud charges, Aurora was a one and done. The Omniums were shut down, and Aurora walked alone as the sole sentient Omnic. For now, at least. For a period of time that I don't think Blizzard has ever explicitly defined, the Omniums were just shut down, they were vacant, and the remaining Omnics continued to be treated like property with the exception of Aurora. Then, suddenly, after a little while, the Omniums suddenly started back up again. Turns out, surprise, a hyper-advanced AI program named Anubis went rogue and decided to show humanity the importance of properly disposing of industrial waste by taking over the defunct Omniums. At this point, again, aside from Aurora, the Omnics still were not sentient. They were more like a hive mind, with Anubis at the center. If you've ever read Ender's Game, and not watched, the movie doesn't count, read the book, it's similar to how the Buggers operated. All the information the Omnics took in was relayed to Anubis, and Anubis itself used it to engage in warfare against humanity. This was the Omnic crisis. Aside from the existing facilities I mentioned earlier, there was at least one new Omnium built by Anubis during the crisis, which benefited from a lack of safeguards that had been built into other facilities. So, the Omnic crisis is underway, and humans do not start it on a strong foot. The Omnics are literally built different, and humanity wasn't exactly prepared to present a united front. Most nations fought separate wars against the Omnics in their own territories, and it didn't go great for them. The Omnics were too strong, too smart, and too adaptable. The humans couldn't see a way to negotiate or even really any sort of ideological goal behind the war. They didn't even know Anubis was behind it to begin with. However, the Omnics aren't the only ones who can adapt, and human strategists and soldiers had started to put the pieces together on how to fight back. Gabriel Reyes, Jack Morrison, Anna Amari, Mina Liao, Reinhard Wilhelm, and Torbjorn Lindholm were brought together by the United Nations to create Overwatch, an elite strike force to fight back against the Omnics. And despite the questionable ethics surrounding the creation of a UN military organization with basically limitless budgets and a license to kill, it did work. Liao was able to identify that the Omniums were taking their marching orders from somebody external, and by cutting off their communications capacity, they could remove the Omniums from the network. Their first attempt was in Detroit, and it succeeded. From there, they identified Anubis as the puppet master behind the crisis, found it, and put it under quarantine. The crisis was over. Now, this was not the worst possible ending, but it is hard to call it a happy one. These non-sentient Omnics have been puppeteered into massacring tens of millions of humans, and humanity is nothing if not great at holding a grudge. Coincidentally, somewhere around this time, Aurora reached Shambali and decided to sacrifice herself in the hopes that she would be able to inspire sentience among all Omnics. According to Shambali, she transcended beyond the planes of existence to reach the Iris, the process of which is described as functionally just looking like Zenyatta's ultimate. Aurora is technically one of the last official Omnics built, as Omnica shut down shortly after her production, and the Omnics produced during the crisis are kinda treated as something different, but in the eyes of Omnics like Ramatra, she's the first of their kind. The first sentient Omnic, whose ascension was successful in spreading sentience to the Omnics at large. Or at least to some of them, usually the humanoid ones. Not every Omnic was capable of sentience even after Aurora's sacrifice, with Omnics like Bastion and Orisa being relative outliers compared to typical Bastion and OR-15 Omnics. However, sentience spread, and just in time for them to be ghettoized by humanity. Not every human hates the Omnics, or at least not enough to the point of like totally excluding them. You know, you can see them in the Los Muertos gang in Mexico during some of Sombra's background materials, the human-Omnic relationships that can be seen in a handful of Overwatch media pieces, and the reverence that both humans and Omnics, at least some humans, have for figures like the Carta Mandata in the Alive cinematic. Despite that, anti-Omnic hate and the fight against it is a big feature of the universe of Overwatch. Widowmaker's assassination of Mandata is meant to cause civil unrest by inflaming existing tensions in London, and Null Sector, as led by Ramatra, is fighting for an Omnic state and general liberation. Even in-game, characters make it clear that anti-Omnic sentiments are a big part of this world and run deep. Torbjorn and Zarya will openly express their distastes for Omnics, particularly, like Bastion, and are not especially receptive to what Zenyatta has to say. A big part of the issue for Omnics is that, while they're now sentient, they can still be taken over by an AI like Anubis and puppeteered just like during the Crisis, as seen in an old Faro comic where an Omnic in her Helix security group was taken over and used by Anubis to kill a member of the squad. In the present day, the Omnics have struggled to find security and safety. The Omnium in Australia, originally given to the Omnics by the Australian government as part of a, olive branch, an effort to establish some peace, was the target of intense anger by locals. Roadhog, among others, formed the Australian Liberation Front, a terrorist group against the Omnics who eventually caused the fusion core of the Omnium to explode, irradiating the area. Today, that Omnium has been taken over by the Junkers to become Junkertown. In King's Row, Omnics are ghettoized in the area of the final point of the map, and while a statue memorializing Takata Mandata's assassination can be seen in the first point, the payload that the attackers are escorting is an EMP that's meant to be used to commit a terrorist attack against Omnics. All around the world, the Omnics are still regularly treated as second-class citizens, if not just being outright attacked. This has been made worse by the beginning of the second Omnic crisis, which began in Russia. Their Omnium had reactivated shortly before the events of Overwatch 1 and was once again attacking the area, and not long after, Null Sector began its attacks on Paris and Rio. On a Talon mission in Russia to assassinate Katya Volskaya, head of Volskaya Industries, Sombra decided to take the opportunity to begin blackmailing her instead.
Okay, listen. I'm here to make a friend. And show you something I found. Tell me, what would happen if the people of Russia learned that their defender against the Omnics was actually getting her tech from the enemy? What would that do to the future of Russia?
What do you want?
She had found that Volskaya had been secretly trading with the Omnics. God forbid women have hobbies, and given that Volskaya was responsible for producing the weapons needed to fight back against the Omnics, it wasn't a good look. The Omnium in the East China Sea is also active again, with Diva being part of the elite group responsible for defending South Korea against them.
Diva engaging!
Wait! You can't do it alone!
Activating defense matrix!
Now, a few things to acknowledge before we go further. First, and I cannot stress this enough, during the Omnic crisis, the Omnics in question were not sentient. They were not choosing to enact war on humanity. Anubis was. Anubis is not an Omnic, only an AI that can take control over other AI. Humanity built machines, and then another non-human entity that they build used those machines to kill humans. After that non-human entity was removed from the picture, Omnics developed sentience from an unrelated event, Aurora's sacrifice, which Omnics call the Awakening, and are now left to fend for themselves in a world where they are the defeated power in a war they were only the weapons for. New Omnics produced after the Awakening do not automatically have sentience unless specifically programmed with an AI that's capable of it, which appears to only be the case for Orisa and Echo, and even then it's kind of shaky, but we'll get into that. Also, the term Omnic as used in universe is a shaky one. Omnic is kind of like Kleenex in the sense that it's technically a brand name for a specific product produced by a specific company, but its dominance in the market makes it so ubiquitous that it's become the generic name for the product in casual conversation. The distinction between Omnic and robot isn't super clear, but in general, the distinction is sentience, or at least something resembling it. Being built in an Omnium, even the same Omnium as an actual Omnic, is not enough. Ramatra was built in the Omnium that Anubis built, and he counts. However, the army that he builds for Null Sector in that same Omnium does not count, even by his own admission. He considers them to be mindless robots, not Omnics. That's why he's okay with sacrificing them, en masse in his war. While new robots can be mass-produced, the sentience that Omnics have can't be. That came from Aurora's sacrifice, and a little bit of engineering. And unless someone can pull off the same feat, there's no way to inspire sentience among the new Omnics. Aurora was an advanced AI the likes of which has never existed before, and thanks to regulation and fear of AI, understandably in that universe, almost certainly never could again. The closest that anyone's ever gotten was Echo. But for that, we need to move on to Part 2, the who's who of the Omnics. So, now that you know the simplified-ish backstory of the Omnics at large, we can explain the Omnics and factions that actually matter for our purposes. This isn't every Omnic or every faction that's ever been seen on screen in Overwatch or like in any supplementary materials, only the ones that play some degree of a meaningful role in the development of the Omnics we haven't already gone over in some detail. I'm going to try and go through these in roughly the order they were introduced, so hopefully it'll make sense that way. I'll try and keep this short, but take that with a grain of salt. You know what channel you're watching. Bastion was one of the original roster of Overwatch heroes, and was part of a line of Omnics originally built for peacekeeping purposes. During a crisis, he was programmed into a killing machine alongside the other Bastion units, and was one of many sent to attack Eichenwald. On the way, he was disabled in combat, causing him to fall dormant in the Black Forest. Eventually, a bird decided to make a nest on him, and I guess that caused him to reactivate and try to head towards the city. Despite a minor PTSD hiccup where he remembered the war and took it out on some trees, his new bird friend, gay icon Ganymede, helped him get over it. He abandoned his mission to attack the city and instead wandered around for a while, eventually ending up in Sweden where he was discovered by Torbjorn, two forming an unlikely friendship. Zenyatta is one of the monks of the Shambali, who we'll be discussing in detail in a second. He was built before the crisis and may or may not be telling the truth about working in a laser tag facility, as a lifeguard, as a tractor driver, and as a barista. Post-crisis, Zenyatta wandered the world, eventually running into a Shambali monk named Ramatra who brought him into the monastery. The two became close, but haven't spoken much since Ramatra formed Null Sector. Zenyatta believes that peace, harmony, and diplomacy between humans and Omnics can eventually overcome their brutal history, putting them at odds with Ramatra's willingness to employ violence. His orbs are Shambali creations used as conduits for Omnic energy, a mysterious concept that's not really well explained, but which Omnics can occasionally harness to do things like levitate. During his time with the Shambali, he mentored Genji post-Overwatch as he dealt with the crisis of his cybernetic identity. In the process, he determined that the Shambali approach wasn't going to be enough. He believed that interpersonal relationships with the humans would be more effective than the dogmatism of the Shambali, so he chose to wander the globe looking to build those relationships. The Shambali are a group of Omnic monks who, post-awakening, abandoned their programming to seek enlightenment. Through the leadership of Takata Mandata, the monks became globally recognized figures, and many Omnics saw them as the best chance that they had of achieving a better life in harmony with the humans. Aurora's sacrifice happened in the presence of the Shambali, or at least the initial few, and she's a particularly important figure to them as well as Omnics in general, alongside the belief in the Iris, a state of transcendence and or afterlife that the Shambali believe all sentient creatures can achieve. Orisa, Zenyatta, and Ramatra are all familiar with the concept, as is Sigma, indicating that the Shambali might be onto something. Takata Mandata was the original leader of the Shambali, and a major figurehead in the effort to bring peace between humans and Omnics. During the Null Sector Uprising, the attack from the Archives event mission of the same name in King's Row, Mandata was one of the Omnics taken hostage by Null Sector after he had come to the city to participate in a groundbreaking ceremony for an Omnic housing project. He was freed by Overwatch, and 7 years later returned to make a speech during the cinematic Alive. Unfortunately for Takata, the Alive in the title did not refer to him. He was assassinated by Widowmaker despite Tracer's efforts, cutting the head off the Shambali and increasing the already high tensions in King's Row. Null Sector is an Omnic liberation group led by Ramatra, whose goal is to establish an independent Omnic nation, as well as to force humanity to make peace with the Omnics. Null Sector was founded after Ramatra grew frustrated with the failure of the Shambali to meaningfully improve the lives of Omnics fast enough, and basically operated under the belief that the only way to get the humans to stop fucking around with the Omnics was to make them find out just how bad it could get for them. Originally, it was led by a handful of Omnics, leading an army of mindless robots produced in Anubis' Omnium. The King's Row Uprising was their first real push.
The Omnic extremist group, Null Sector, launched a surprise attack on King's Row. Hundreds were killed, and thousands more were displaced as they took control. Now, they are hunting down the last of the survivors. It could be the beginning of a new war between humans and Omnics.
It was a disaster. Overwatch violated UK law to intervene, defeating the uprising and killing one of their leaders. After the uprising, they were denounced as terrorists by the Shambali, among others, and the original leaders of Null Sector left Ramatra to lead the organization alone. 7 years later, in the present day of the game in Overwatch 2, Null Sector is back as a major antagonistic group.
Bonjour, officer. We're here to help.
C'était un singe?
Maximilian is a wealthy Omnic who owns a casino in Monaco as well as the distillery in Havana that makes up the second point of the map. On top of that, he's part of the inner circle of Talon alongside Doomfist, and that status made him the primary target of the Overwatch mission seen in the Storm Rising Archives event. Upon being captured, he immediately agrees to cooperate with Overwatch on locating Doomfist, who is arrested just weeks later.
Going somewhere, Max?
Is this really necessary? Surely we can make some kind of deal.
You are in no position to negotiate.
You're coming with us.
We know all about you and your associates.
Oh, I have many associates. Perhaps it's not clear what I have to offer. My resources are quite substantial. Let me ask, what might you be in the market for?
An introduction.
Ah, and who is it you would like to meet?
However, as part of his deal with Overwatch, they didn't inform him of Max's involvement. When Doomfist gets out of prison, the two are still working together in Talon. Bob was originally the butler for Ash's family, and due to her parents' neglect, generally assumed a dual role as a parental figure / servant. Bob is incapable of speech, presumably because the wealthy didn't want to buy Omnic butlers who might talk back to them, so it's actually honestly not super clear whether or not Bob is truly sentient. The best argument against his sentience is that he unquestioningly follows orders from Ash, and hasn't really demonstrated a ton of real independent thought, autonomy, or emotion. Although given they can't speak, this might be more of a I have no mouth and I must scream kind of situation. On the flip side, he was not Ash's property. He was her parents' butler, and yet he abandoned them to follow Ash to the Deadlock Gang, indicating that he was motivated by loyalty to her rather than any programming.
Bob! Do something!
Looks like Bob got himself some upgrades.
He's also a pre-Omnic Crisis Omnic, indicating that he probably should have received sentience from the Awakening.
Sorry about that, Bob. No hard feelings.
Orisa was built by Ifi Oladele from the wreckage of the OR-15 Omnics that had previously defended Numbani until they were destroyed in an attack by Doomfist.
I was at the airport when Doomfist attacked. Poor bots didn't stand a chance. Everyone else gave up on you, but I saw what you could be. So I rebuilt you, upgraded your programming, and gave you a heart.
New personality module installed. System rebooting. OR-15 online.
No, that's no good. Every great hero needs a real name. What about Orisa?
Ifi was a talented roboticist who wanted to produce a hero of Numbani that could protect them from future attacks, but the process was very much so one of trial and error. Eventually, over time, Orisa was able to develop to the point of helping Lucio to defend Numbani against another Doomfist attack, becoming a hero. Given that she was not constructed in an Omnium, and her sentience is perhaps more artificial than some other Omnics, relying on things like a compassion module rather than the natural sentience of other sentient Omnics, she's in a bit of a gray area. But the game calls her an Omnic, and she looks like an Omnic, and she's built from the parts of an Omnic, so she's an Omnic. Echo was a top-secret project of Mina Liao from her days at Overwatch. An incredibly advanced adaptive AI, Mina had learned a little bit from her girl boss days and built in more intensive security protocols to avoid Echo breaking her programming. Similarly to Orisa, she exists in a bit of an Omnic limbo. She was not built in an Omnium, and she does not have sentience in the same way as those who achieved it through the awakening caused by Aurora's sacrifice. However, unlike Orisa, Echo was built by Liao herself, the creator of Aurora, which means that it's probably the closest any Omnic post-awakening can meaningfully get to that level of sentience.
You are my life's work. You will be everything I dreamed. All I wanted, all I needed, was to help the world. And so, she created me. Her legacy. Her promise. Her echo.
Echo's adaptability led her to take on the personality and mannerisms of the people around her, primarily Dr. Liao herself. She was involved in some Overwatch missions, but given her power and capacity for both adaptability and replication, she was kept on a pretty short leash. After Liao's death in an attack on an Overwatch facility, the organization basically just decided they didn't have anyone else they trusted to be competent enough to keep up with Liao's work on Echo, and so shut her down in quarantine. After Overwatch fell, she was taken into custody by the US government until the Deadlock Gang, led by Ash, hijacked a train she was being transported on after Winston initiated the recall. Cassidy hijacked the hijacking and saved Echo, telling her to join up with the rest of Overwatch.
Hey there, cowboy.
She did just that, joining Overwatch in Paris to fight off the Null Sector attack in the 0-hour cinematic.
Hello, Winston!
Echo!
Ramatra is the most recent Omnic added to the roster, and as mentioned in bits and pieces so far, takes a much more militant approach to Omnic liberation. He's a Ravager unit built in the Omnium that Anubis created, and he was meant to lead Anubis' armies to battle. But after the crisis, he eventually became one of the early Shambali monks under Takarda and a close friend of Zenyatta. Ramatra grew frustrated that Omnics continued being abused, leading him to believe that Shambali's approach would not succeed. On top of that, Ramatra is particularly concerned about the survivability of the Omnics as a species. If an Omnic dies, their parts might be reused, such as with Orisa, but their spirit dies with them.
We have tried to coexist with humanity, but humanity is not interested in sharing their world. How many more Omnics should perish to fuel mankind's dreams? No more. Our race is only a single generation. Finite. And dying all too quickly.
Given that Omnics cannot reproduce and that there's not a known way for their sentience to be spread to newly built robots, they're a limited species. Every death is an Omnic who will not be replaced, and to Ramatra, that matters. If he has to kill humans to save Omnics, so be it. Our species can repopulate. Their species can't. So, at this point we've talked about the story of the Omnics and we've talked about the major-ish Omnic players. However, I said at the start and in the title that this video isn't just about who the Omnics are, it's about why Overwatch's approach to them is shallow storytelling. And for that, we need to move on to Part 3, How Blizzard Flopped with the Omnics. The main problem with Omnics as a storytelling device is the same problem faced by countless other stories that have tried to do the same thing Blizzard has, namely, make an allegory for racism and discrimination by using creatures of different species. This happens a lot with media where different types of animals, like cats and dogs, are used to try and do the same thing. A fundamentally important part of race as a social concept is that it is internal to a species. Racism, as a form of bigotry, is related to how we perceive people who are different within our own species, just like misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, or any other kind of bigotry. This kind of analogy is bad when it's done between two different animal species, but it gets upgraded to being bad when humans are still kept as one of the groups involved, because then you end up with stupid shit like these posters in the Shambali Monastery map talk about how Omnics can't come to this place and sit at the tables because they don't need food. It is a segregationist poster, just like countless posters and messages of all sorts refusing service or access to places to people on the basis of race throughout history. The poster is trying to make a logical argument. Omnics don't need food, so they shouldn't take up a seat. It misses the point of segregation, which was that it wasn't about some sort of logical, physiological argument or anything like that. It was about people who felt that one race was superior to others, and that the superior race should not be forced to share space with their inferiors. There was no logic behind the notion that black people shouldn't be allowed to sit at a lunch counter or should have to sit at the back of the bus. It was purely the racist belief that black and other non-white people are not equal to white people and should be kept separate. To be clear, this is a dogshit vision of the world. It's not a defensible position. I want to make that very clear up front because I feel like there are points in this video where it might sound like I'm trying to say, like, you're not doing racism well enough. Like, I want to establish that here. Or, for another example, let's talk about those mixed Omnic-human relationships from earlier. Combined with how Omnics are more generally presented, it's most closely analogous to a mixed-race relationship. The problem being, it totally misses the reasons why mixed-race relationships have faced so many social, political, and legal challenges. Laws against interracial relationships don't just exist because people don't want people to fall in love across racial lines like some Romeo and Juliet shit. It's because of racists who didn't want people from other races contaminating, and again, I'm not supporting this view, obviously, I'm using the heaviest possible air quotes around that word, contaminating their bloodlines. Using the Omnics as part of a racism analogy in this context just straight up misses what motivates racism in the context of interracial relationships. Like, it isn't just people who think, oh, we're different and I can't handle that. It's a fundamental assumption of superiority of one race over others, a motivation to protect their race's purity from the others, and an assumption that people from other races entering their gene pool will be degrading its quality. These sort of issues come into especially sharp focus when we don't just look at the big picture stuff. Ramatra, Zenyatta, Orisa, Echo, and Bastion represent the 5 playable Omnics. Zenyatta is a mystical monk who can legit do magic, or, like, science we can't explain yet, who believes in peaceful coexistence of Omnics and humans. Ramatra is a former monk with the same basic abilities, at least in theory, whose fundamental flaw in the eyes of the narrative is that he's too violent in his pushback against the actual ongoing, if relatively slow, genocide of his people. Zenyatta believes that Ramatra is wrong in his approach, and that it's unacceptable to take such extreme measures. The problem with that is that Ramatra is just literally correct. Like, he's apparently the only one who recognizes that the Omnics are a limited species who cannot reproduce, and every death is a permanent -1 to their total population. Like, this is very different from any sort of a real-world human racism analogy. Urgent action is necessary to protect the Omnics who did not consciously or deliberately commit the atrocities of the Omnic crisis and yet are being punished for it. He is fundamentally correct in his assertion that humanity in the Overwatch universe is uniquely cruel and unsympathetic to the plight of the Omnics, and doesn't seem to understand any language other than violence. Zenyatta and the Shambali haven't even been able to convince the humans of the Shambali village to see them as equals, and terrorists like Talon are prepared to obliterate the peaceful Omnics purely because it stirs up more chaos that benefits them. Bastion, meanwhile, is just literally built for murder, and I really, truly hope I don't need to explain to you why it's not a very good racism analogy if a large chunk of your stand-ins for non-white people are literally manufactured for mindless violence. Orisa is also built for violence, and if someone ever removed her compassion core, she'd just stop caring about anything about her mission, as proven when EP did so, and she did exactly that. Echo, on the flip side, entirely revolves around the concept that she's literally only capable of replicating the personalities of others around her. She was built with limiters in place specifically so that she couldn't achieve the levels of sentience or autonomy that other Omnics had, and so has developed a personality that's just Liao, but a robot. The reality is that Omnics do not get to choose how Omnics are created. As the graffiti in King's Row eloquently says, they were built to serve, in the most literal sense of the words. The Omnics were built by humans, for humans, almost exclusively without input from Omnics at any stage in the process. And then humans turned around and abused the Omnics for it. Now, as an analogy for racism, it's clearly influenced specifically by the American concept of and history with racism, because Blizzard is an American company and will pull from the culture that they are familiar with. Particularly the kidnapping and enslavement of black people from Africa to work in plantations and do the grueling labor that white colonists and settlers didn't want to do. The economic capacity of the plantations under slavery was immense. There is a reason why people were willing to fight a civil war to protect states' rights to allow for legalized slavery. Omnics in the Overwatch universe are seen similarly to how many racists saw black people during that era of American history, as a lesser race whose existence on this earth was to support their superiors through labor and exploitation. The reason why this is such a fucked up analogy is that black people were not that. Okay, I cannot emphasize that enough. Slavery in the real world and exploitation of marginalized people was based on bullshit racism. There was no basis in logic. The Omnics were built to serve, and this is why the whole use robots as an analogy for racism thing is such an inevitably bad idea in storytelling. The implications of it are always bad. Like, okay, a Roomba is built to serve, and even if it became sentient, it would still have been explicitly built with the purpose of vacuuming. You could try and rebuild it into a different machine, but even still, you would always have to deal with the reality that it was initially deliberately constructed, manufactured, engineered to perform a specific form of labor. Human beings are not built to serve anyone or anything. Not on the basis of race, not on the basis of gender, nothing. Black people who were enslaved in the United States weren't built in a factory by engineers thinking, oh yes, we want this one to be really good at harvesting cotton, so we'll build them with that specific hardware that'll enable that or something. They were human beings who were forced into slave labor to pick cotton or work as house slaves or any number of other forms of labor because they were seen as subhuman by racists. Humans are not built in some intentional way that would justify a comparison to robots who are literally purpose-built like this. So making an analogy where your stand-in for marginalized races is a manufactured species literally built for servitude that has developed sentience beyond that capacity is honestly, frankly, pretty racist in and of itself. Omnics in Overwatch not being allowed to sit at a table in a diner because they can't eat, or androids in Detroit becoming human being forced to stand at the back of the bus because they physiologically do not need a chair, or any number of other instances of robots being used by weak storytellers to try and make a deeper point about racism are examples of people who fundamentally don't understand the issues they're talking about and are making clumsy metaphors with genuinely harmful implications. This gets even worse when we remember that, once again, Omnics were not responsible for the Omnic crisis. To keep up this comparison with a Roomba, it's like if you bought a Roomba that was built for vacuuming and some other random person hacked it, programmed it to chase after you, and then attached a knife to it. The crisis was the result of Anubis, a non-Omnic AI that humans built, commandeering them and using them as weapons. Blaming them for this is like if cars had developed sentience after World War II and we blame them for everything that they had been used for during the war. Like, it's not just fundamentally illogical, on top of that, it's a bad analogy to real-world racism because it implies that racism is maybe wrong, but still understandable or even justifiable because the Omnics are still vulnerable to being hacked and used as weapons all over again. However, this video isn't just about why that storytelling is harmful or bad, but specifically why it's shallow. So, let's talk about that. Part 4. What makes the Omnics shallow? Shallow storytelling is obviously what it says on the tin. It's storytelling without depth. It's storytelling without a real curiosity about the world, without a real willingness or ability to explore a unique or challenging subject, and without a real understanding of the implications of your work. Overwatch's Omnics are shallow storytelling not only because they demonstrate all three of those attributes, but because they invoke these big concepts and these challenging social, political, and cultural ideas without any understanding of what they're doing with it. If you want to tell a shallow, simple story, honestly, that's totally fine. I've described shallowness so far as a bit of an inherently negative characteristic in storytelling, but there's nothing inherently wrong with there being a shallow end to a swimming pool. Frankly, a lot of the most popular, iconic, long-lasting stories across cultures are ones that are relatively shallow. Not every narrative needs to try and be The Hobbit. The specific problem with Overwatch's storytelling in general, most clearly manifested through the portrayal and conceptualization of the Omnics, is not that the narrative is stuck in the shallow end. It's that they've built a deep pool but only filled it with a foot of water, and then told people it's safe to dive. The Omnics did not need to be this deep, and given the quality of writing demonstrated with them, or the lack of quality for being really real here, they shouldn't have been. Robots as an analogy for racism are always an extremely bad idea, and there's just no two ways around it. It kneecaps your story. To keep up the pool analogy, it's like building a pool that's 3 meters deep and putting a hole in the side about a foot above the bottom. It'd be one thing if the Omnics were incidental to the narrative of Overwatch, but they also aren't. They are the key to the whole thing. Overwatch as an organization only exists in response to the Omnic crisis. So without Omnics, there's no Omnic crisis. Without the Omnic crisis, there's not only no Overwatch, but no Talon, no Null Sector, no Shambhala, no nothing. Getting the Omnics right was crucial, and Overwatch got it wrong. That's not to say that they shouldn't have done the Omnics, or that they couldn't have tried to tell a deeper story with them even, to be clear. I like the concept of the Omnics, they're not bad, and there's legitimately a lot to work with there. It just shouldn't have been a racism analogy. Make it a story about humanity as grappling with the complex reality of science and spirituality that they live in. How the Omnics, once functionally nothing more than humanoid robots, have developed souls. And not because humans programmed them to, but because one human programmed one robot to have such a powerful, advanced artificial intelligence that it enabled sentience. And she chose to use that sentience to sacrifice herself, because it meant she had a slim chance to share that gift with her species. Like, the Omnics have developed an understanding of spirituality that has unlocked profound new insights into the world, not only in terms of scientific concepts like Omnic energy, something they were not built to do, but developed on their own and is so inexplicable it's closer to magic than anything else, but also in terms of higher planes of spiritual existence. Humanity, over its millennia of existence, never reached a level of transcendence akin to what the Omnics have, and it was the Omnics, not the humans, who discovered the Iris. Not only that, but whatever the Iris is, it's something that both humans and Omnics are able to experience in some capacity. Ramatra, Zenyatta, Orisa, and Sigma all acknowledge it, with Sigma stating he's even spoken with it. Like, that's incredibly profound. Like, when I say that I think Overwatch's approach to the Omnics is shallow, a big part of that is obviously a genuine frustration with how they've tremendously fucked up a racism analogy. But another big part of it is that they're leaving so much good shit on the table. You can tell a story about how the Omnics and humanity have a tense relationship as a result of the crisis, or how there are anti-Omnic humans or anti-human Omnics, or how Omnics still have to push for civil liberties. These are still variables that would reasonably exist in a world with Omnics. That doesn't mean they need to be the core of the narrative though, and they absolutely do not need to be treated like they're analogous to real-world racism, because they just aren't. But you can still include elements of that in the narrative for sure without completely butchering it. Those issues make it bad storytelling, but what makes it specifically shallow is the failure to capitalize on the genuinely interesting concepts the Omnics invoke. Aurora is proof that humanity can manufacture sentience. Not only sentience, but autonomous sentience, and the challenges that can pose. Aurora gained sentience and immediately chose to explore the world, trying to learn everything she could. And eventually, she decided that the gift of sentience was too great to hoard. The sentience that humanity created was a selfless one, driven to spirituality even as a literal machine developed by cold hard science. Her sacrifice was one that inherently rejects all logic towards self-preservation and instead invests fully in an emotional, loving, selfless vision of the world. Like, I can't overstate, that is a genuinely incredibly profound concept to consider. The idea that we as a species might be capable of creating sentience that is stronger, better and faster than humanity in every way, and instead of using it to seek power or to enrich itself, it chose to sacrifice itself to bring sentience to every other Omnic. The deeper story would be one that doesn't focus on the sort of bad analogy to real-world marginalization, but one that embraces the genuine potential of a universe where this sort of thing exists. A world where spirituality and science are inextricably linked, where we explore the reality of a world where Symmetra, Winston, and Moira science coexist with Zenyatta's Harmony and Discord orbs, or Hanzo and Genji's dragons for that matter. Or, I don't know, the literal miracle of manufactured sentience. Not only would it avoid the insane implications created by the clumsy attempts to draw parallels between real-world racism and the complicated questions on the use of violence as a self-defense strategy against ongoing systemic violence, but it would also ask genuinely interesting questions about the nature of our existence in a way that could not only be interesting, but hopeful and promising. Characters don't need to have an hour-long sit-down discussion about the philosophy of this stuff, but like, if there were robots that existed today that had developed consciousness through a spiritual awakening and then had discovered divinity in the span of like half an hour, do you not think that that would be the big question of the day surrounding them? Omnics found God, with proof, in the time that it takes a bronze player to find the fucking objective, and then also incidentally meditated so hard that they developed supernatural, inexplicable abilities and invented a new kind of energy that nobody even theorized existing. And you think the most interesting story to tell about that is the world where, everyone's just being racist to them? Because of a war where they had literally no control over anything that happened because they did not have consciousness? Overwatch's Omnics aren't just shallow storytelling because they're a bad racism analogy. They're shallow storytelling because there are so many genuinely fascinating elements of the world that Overwatch has built around the Omnics that's just thrown away in favor of a tacky, tasteless analogy that's nothing but a sea of red flags and harmful implications. Blizzard absolutely did not need to try and tell a deeper story with Overwatch like this to begin with. Let's be perfectly clear. If they had made this a straightforward narrative of good guys and bad guys, it would have honestly probably been just fine. The heroes and villains of the story, especially a lot of the central villains, are so cartoonishly morally unambiguous that it's bizarre to go from Doomfist's whole, we must do terrorism because that'll cause humanity to evolve philosophy, to a story that wrongly thinks it has something meaningful to say about systemic oppression and marginalization, especially given that, in this context, all actual bigotry between humans seems to just not be a factor. Is the implication that this is a post-racism world because we all got that far on board with hating the Omnics? We did the whole, we might be enemies, but we'll unite to fight an even bigger enemy trope, except instead of enemies, humanity was just prioritizing who to be racist against? And to be clear, I'm not saying that this game also has to have human-on-human racism either. Frankly, it would be better if this silly shooter game with the quirky cast of weirdos just didn't touch on the subject of racism at all. It isn't equipped to do it well, and a multiplayer-only, non-story game does not really have the capacity to fully explore the subject in a way that could do it justice, even if we weren't starting from the position that it is an insanely bad use of Omnics as a vehicle for having the discussion. The problem with Omnics as a storytelling device is that the Overwatch writers decided to build a big, deep pool, and then didn't bring the water necessary to fill it because the premise that they've latched themselves onto is too small of a bucket to transport it. I'm actually not super certain that this analogy is working, but let's just say that it's a deliberately wonky one in keeping with the theme of the video, so you're not allowed to criticize me for it. It's on theme. Overwatch should have never tried to use the Omnics for this, and should have either stuck to a more shallow concept that they could more easily achieve, or picked a deeper concept that would have actually had the capacity to explore in a way that could have fully filled that bigger pool. Instead, the story is jumping off a diving board head first into 6 inches of water, and it isn't going great. Can't wait to see how the PvE handles this now that Ramatra's Null Sector is a primary antagonist. Assuming that the PvE actually does still show up in some form. Frankly, with Blizzard's track record, I'll believe it when I see it. Anyways, that's where we're gonna wrap this one up. Thank you very much for stopping by to watch this, and apologies again for being late. Be sure to let me know your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the next video on the channel. The Clue movie and telling stories about games without stories is a video I'm very excited for, and was chosen by my channel members in the last poll, and it'll be coming out sometime next week depending on how bad my life falls apart. Next month's Members' Choice poll will be between these 4 topics, 2 new ones and 2 returnees. So if you'd like to get a vote in that poll, as well as access to some lovely emotes, members badges, and shoutouts and videos, you can click the join button below to become a member for $5. Or stop by when I'm live sometime and see if you can get lucky enough to be gifted a membership. Thank you to all of my members. Insert name here, Mini Q, Olesp, Cage the Orc, Surtur Z, The Afro of Doom, Nballs, We're On, Dimsnoms, Gvost, Kirby PPG, Alex Stone, Lenny, Lewis McCaig, Enso_EXE, Cameton, Squidgy, Shiver, Disprozy, Sebastian Snow Miller, Nemo the Survivor, NDD, Nebby Bag, Adam Bennett, Destiny, Remy Starlight, Checkmate77, Aiden Braddock, Vamplin, Popsneck, and Connor for all of your support. This month has gone better than I could have ever anticipated for my channel, and I am genuinely just so grateful to all of you. Whether you're a subscriber, member, or commenter, or just a viewer, thank you so much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.